Hello, good afternoon. Today we're going to be talking about three pioneering founders for cognitive psychology or cognitive processes as we know it. And today we're going to be discussing William James's principle of psychology, John Watson's behaviorism approach, and Skinner's operant conditioning. So let's start from the first person, who is William James. And what we're going to be discussing today is the principles of psychology as proposed by William James, and certain subheadings or certain conversations that we're going to be having concerning William James would include the idea of stream of consciousness, functionalism, habits, emotion and the James-Lange theory, self and identity, attention and will. So let's go into who William James is. So he's regarded as the father of American psychology, and in the year 1890, he introduced or he published a book called The Principles of Psychology, and at the time it was thought of as the most influential book in psychology. All right, so under the stream of consciousness, William James introduced the idea that consciousness was flowing, like it was not static in the way structuralism believed it to be. Because if you remember, we remember that when we spoke about structuralism, we talked about it in the sense that the mind was broken down into components, and then those components were thought of as static. But William James he kind of like said that that was not the case, and he came up with his own principles or like his own thoughts concerning how the mind works or how the mind works in general. So that's why he came up with the streams of consciousness. And the idea of stream of consciousness is that the mind is described as a continuous flowing nature, or rather, thought is described as a continuous flowing nature. So let's just go over that again. So James introduced the stream of consciousness to describe the continuous flowing nature of human thought. So as opposed to the structuralist belief that the thought was static or thought was static, with the stream of consciousness, it kind of like told us that okay, no, thought isn't static, but instead, thought constantly moves and it constantly flows. So let's just think about when we think of something, we see that we don't necessarily think in big chunks or like blocks. It's mostly a flowing state. So that's what this is talking about, or that's what William James introduced. All right. So he argued that consciousness is not a series of discrete static elements, but rather a dynamic, ever changing process. So, what are the key features of the stream of consciousness? The stream of consciousness, one of the key features of the stream of consciousness is continuous flow, which is that consciousness is like a river and it continuously moves and is flowing and is continuously changing. So William James was saying that your consciousness is like a stream of river. You see the way when waves are moving or water is moving, and then it's constantly moving and changing. It's not static and it's not discrete like it was initially thought of. So another second key feature of the stream of consciousness was selective attention. And what does selective attention mean in this case? It means that within the stream of consciousness, within our thoughts or within our consciousness, we focus on certain things while ignoring others. So, for example, now if you're thinking of things like, for example, if you're thinking, there are certain times where you will notice that your attention is on something in particular, while ignoring other things that are like seemingly in the background. So, some one of the feature of stream of consciousness was that attention is within the stream. Attention is always selective, meaning that you focus on certain things and then other things are just going to fade in the background. All right. So he also said that the stream of consciousness is personal and subjective, meaning it is very dependent on individuals, and each person's stream of consciousness is different and it's personal and is always shaped by their experiences. That's basically the key features of stream of consciousness. So when he introduced this stream of consciousness, it challenged the structuralist belief that was already the ruling school of thought at the time. So this stream of consciousness and William James's contribution to psychology, cognitive psychology, brought about the functionalist school of thought. All right, so we're going to move to functionalism now. So something that William James has also proposed in his movement or in his stream of consciousness was that the mind is a dynamic and holistic um, thing, like it's a dynamic and holistic system. For example, now in the structuralist belief, they always believe that it was static, and it could be broken down into different bits, and those different bits could be studied. But what William James was saying rather was that when it comes to stream of conscious, when it comes to the mind, rather, that when it comes to the mind is a holistic thing. Like those things within the mind, or the structures within the mind, do not work in silos. So it's just like we should think of the mind as an holistic system. All right, so let's move to functionalism. And functionalism was a school of thought that focused on the purpose and function of mental processes rather than the structure. So what functionalism was doing was that it was majorly focusing on the purpose and the function of mental processes. So functionalism was influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution, and he emphasized the adaptive role of the mind. All right. So what were the key ideas within the functionalist school of thought? One key idea within the functionalist school of thought was its adaptive processes. And it says that mental processes exist because they serve a purpose within individuals. And okay, they serve an adapt sorry adaptive purposes adaptive processes. When it comes to um, the key idea within functionalism is that mental processes exist because they serve a purpose in helping individuals adapt to their environment. So what that means is that with functionalism, it was basically saying that mental processes exist because it wants to help individuals to adapt to their environment. So let us think about a mental process. Let's say something like perception, which is a mental process. Everything was something like perception, which is a mental process. What the functionalists believe was that when it comes to all of these mental processes, they're not just there because of they want to be there. They are there because they want to help individuals. They want to help individuals adapt to their environment. So that's one of the functionalist key ideas. Another thing with functionalism was that it focused on practicality, meaning that it said that psychology should study the mind function in real life. Like it should not just be abstract concepts, and it should be studied in real life. All right. So it also, another key idea of functionalism was the holistic approach, which means that the mind should be studied as a whole instead of being broken down into parts. You remember that the structuralists believe that the mind should be broken down into parts. Meanwhile, this functionalism school of thought was saying that when it comes to the mind, you should study it as a whole and not just in parts. All right. So the implication of the functionalism was that it shifted the school of thought, and it shifted how people thought of the mind at that time, from structuralist belief where they think that okay, the mind should be broken down and the mind is static, to functionalist belief which believes that the mind is dynamic and the mind should be studied holistically and as a whole. So let's move on to the next part, which is habits. All right, so James placed great emphasis on the role of habits in shaping behaviors and mental processes. He believed that habits are the foundation of much of human behavior, and that they free up mental resources for more complex tasks. So what James was basically talking about was that when it comes to habits, he really strongly believed in habits, and he felt that habits were the foundations of human behavior. Like habits drive our behavior. That's what his belief was. All right. So, and he says that when it comes to habits help us to free up cognitive space, meaning that they free up our mind and our mental space to take up more complex tasks. So it means that if you have something as an habit, you have more cognitive capacity to process other things. So just think of any habit that you think that you have. When you're performing that habit, it's almost automatic. So it leaves you time, and it leaves you mental and cognitive space to focus on other type of tasks. All right, so let's go to the key ideas that William James proposed when it comes to habits. So he was saying that habits are formed through experience. Sorry, he was saying that habits are formed through repetition and practice. So something that William James was talking about when it comes to the formation of habits was that habits are formed through repetition and practice. All right, and he said once habits are formed, they allow us to perform tasks without much effort. Meaning that once habits are formed, the effort required to perform a task is greatly reduced. And then he also argued that good habits are essential for personal development and societal progress. All right. So something that William James helped to do was that he highlighted the importance of habits formation in education and self-improvement. and it provided the psychological basis for understanding automatic behaviors. So at the time, people did not necessarily understand how habits work, or the process to which habits are formed, or how habits actually influence human behavior. So something that William James contributed to in the field of cognitive psychology was that he helped us understand habits how habits propagate automatic behaviors. All right, so let's move on to the next one, which is emotions when it comes to William James. So emotions and the James-Lange theory. William James, alongside Carl Lange, proposed the James-Lange theory of emotion, which suggests that emotions are the result of physiological responses to stimuli rather than the other way around. These physiological responses follows as a result of emotion. So what does that mean? So basically, William James worked together with Carl Lange, and they developed something called the James-Lange theory of emotion. And in James-Lange theory of emotion, it was basically talking about the fact that emotions are as a result of physiological response as opposed to the other way around. And what do we mean by that? It means that James and Lange, they were proposing a theory that says that when it comes to emotions, that you feel emotion because of your body's reaction to that stimuli, not because of um okay, let me just give an example for us to understand it better. So assuming that you see a bear, let's say you go out or you're in the field or something like that, and then you see a bear. James Lange's theory of emotion is saying that your heart will first start racing, and it's because your heart has started racing, that's why you now feel fear. That's basically what the James Lange theory was talking about. That okay, you see a bear, which is the stimuli, and then your heart starts to race, which is the physiological response, and then you feel the emotion, which is fear. All right, but there was also somebody that came and said no, that's not correct, and his theory received a criticism from okay, yes, this his theory received criticism, and then it now brought about the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion. That's the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion. We said that that's wrong, and that we don't actually feel emotions because of our body's physiological responses. That when it comes to emotions and physiological responses work hand in hand, and they are not just. It's not that one happens before the other; they work together. That's what the Cannon-Bard theory um proposed as a criticism to James-Lange theory. So let's explain the James-Lange theory further. So, for example, at the time when the James-Lange theory was introduced, the common sense knowledge was that when you perceive a stimulus, meaning let's say you see a bear, you feel an emotion which is fear, and then because of that fear, your heart starts to race, and then that's the physiological response. But the James-Lange theory, remember that we said that it was the opposite way around. James and Lange were introducing the fact that when you perceive a stimulus, see a bear, your body reacts to that stimulus. Let's say you start to shiver or your heart starts to race, the physiological response. So it's not like your body will not interpret that physiological response to an emotion. When your body will not say, oh, because her heart is racing, that means that she's afraid. But that was not that was I mean that was criticized, and it later became um Cannon-Bard's theory of emotion criticized James-Lange theory of emotion. So, basically, an implication for the James-Lange theory of emotion is that it introduced the concept of emotion, and that emotions can be studied, or emotions can actually be a cognitive process that can be studied and can be measured, or can even be paid attention to. So, yes. All right. So, okay. But I think we've talked about some certain key ideas when it comes to the James-Lange theory. We know that the James-Lange theory has a physiological basis. It says that emotion arise from our perception of bodily changes. I've explained that already. And then I've also talked about the implication of the James-Lange theory. So I hope you understand the James-Lange theory. All right. So let's move to self and identity, which was another key thing that William James introduced. So, self and identity. James' exploration of the self is one of his most enchanting contribution, or most enhancing contribution, because he actually introduced the idea of self. So, he distinguished between the I, the knowing self, and the me, the known self, and he identified multiple components of the self. So, the key ideas of the I and the me that was part of the self and identity that William James proposed was that the I is the subjective thinking self that experiences and interprets the world. The I is the subjective thinking self that experiences and interprets the world. Meaning that when you think of the I, it's the subjective self. Is the person that is within the emotion, that is experiencing the world through how do I say experiencing the world through experiences, but we can say experiencing the world through experiences. So the I is the subjective thinking self, is the one that is experiencing the world through experiences and interprets the world, like interprets the experiences within that person's life. And then the me is the objective self that is consistent, that is consistent of the material, social, and spiritual aspect of identity. So let's not forget, when it comes to William James self and identity, he was basically talking, distinguishing between the I and the me. And the I is thought of as the subjective self, the subjective thinking self that experiences, or that is the one that is going through the experiences of living and life. And then the me is like the spiritual self, or the objective self, that is the like material self. So what do we mean by that? It means that the me is considered the spiritual, the social, and all of those material aspects of self, of an individual. Let's not say self, but of an individual. All right. So let's talk about the components of the me. And then when it comes to the component of the me, we have the material self, which includes the body, possession, and physical environment. So let's just think about it like that. When you're trying to say, oh, I have something, or this is mine, when it comes to when we're thinking of ourselves as me, like let's just try and conceptualize it a little bit or make it more concrete. When we're thinking of ourselves as me, or when you want to say, okay, this belongs to me, and all of that, it always has to do with something material, if you understand me, compared to if you were thinking about your thoughts, or you were thinking about, oh, how did it feel like when I bought an ice cream, which is an experience, or how did it feel like when my friend told me that we could not go to this party despite the fact that I had been planning for it. So that's like the difference between the I and the me. The I is the subjective thinking self, and then the me is the concrete or the material objective self. All right. So an implication for the self and identity that William James proposed was that it helped us understand, and it gave us a comprehensive framework for understanding the complexity of self-concept. So I know that we heard about self-concept in different courses and different fields. So one of the key contributions to self-concept was William James. All right, let's move on to attention so that we can round off on William James and talk about the other two guys. So when it comes to attention, James identified attention as the process of focusing the mind on a particular object or thought. He emphasized the selective nature of attention and its role in shaping our experiences of the world. So basically, James was also the person that introduced attention. So he was talking about attention and how our mind focuses on certain stimuli while ignoring other stimuli, which is called selective attention. So it was based on the key ideas when it comes to attention for William James was selective attention, when he says that we can only focus on a limited number of things at a time. Attention determines what enter our conscious awareness. So William just was basically talking about how attention is like the filtering system through which we perceive the world, meaning that we don't perceive the world as like, okay, just taking in every stimuli that comes into our being, that we perceive the world through attention, because our attention is the filtering system through which certain things enter into our consciousness. All right. So he also talked about the fact that attention is effortful. So it requires that effortful attention, rather, that there are different types of attention. So we have effortful attention and we have passive attention. Effortful attention can also be called active attention. And then he was saying that with this type of attention, it requires conscious effort and is used for complex or a task that we're not familiar with. And then when it comes to passive attention, it occurs automatically and is drawn from external stimuli or habits. All right, so let's talk about the will, which is the last concept when it comes to William James's contribution that we're going to discuss in today. And in the will, James' concept of will refers to the ability to direct attention and effort toward a goal, even in the face of distractions or completing desires. So what William James was talking about when it comes to will is that will is effortful. Will takes you to direct your attention towards a goal, even when there are conflicting desires. So just think about a situation whereby you think that, oh, you would rather do A or B, or B is so tempting, but you rather go towards A. That is will in place. That's will in action. So will is talking about effortful attention towards a particular thing or towards a particular goal despite conflicting desires. All right. So he believes that willpower is essential for self-control and personal growth. The key ideas when it comes to will is that effort of attention, like I mentioned before, that will always require active attention. It will require the effortful direction of your attention towards a chosen goal. And then he says that habits reduce the need for willpower by automating behavior, but will is necessary to form habits or overcome old ones. So when we think about habits and will in general, it says that when you have an habit, you don't necessarily need a lot of will. But when you want to create that habit or you want to change an old habit, you need will to be able to do that. So we're done discussing William James, and then we'll be moving on to um, Watson's behaviorism approach. So John B. Watson, behaviorism approach. And when um, Watson came into the picture or came into the view, he was focusing on behaviorism. And what Watson was basically saying was that you guys should leave, like he was basically telling them that time that you people should leave all of this introspection and just trying to measure the inner states of the mind, which I don't think is it's very, which I don't think is so objective and is very subjective. So when it, John B. Watson was basically saying that you people as psychologists or those guys as psychologists should focus on the observable behavior of humans, meaning that you should try and study what you see. What you see is what's important. It's not about the introspection, it's not about the internal states of the human being, it's about their behaviors, what you can see on the outside. So something that John B. Watson was always particular about when it comes to his approach was that he believed that environment was the key factor. Environment was the key factor when it comes to behavior. That behavior is very, very dependent on environment. And he said a very popular statement. Then I would say, okay, give me a dozen young infants, and then he can train them to become whatever he chooses them to be: a doctor, a lawyer, a thief, anything at all. So what John B. Watson was basically saying was that when it comes to behavior, when it comes to studying the mind of individuals, we should focus on the observable behaviors that we see within this person, behaviors that we can see for ourselves, that we can measure. That's what John B. Watson was basically talking about. And then he also built on the work of Ivan Pavlov. He built on the work of Ivan Pavlov to create the Little Albert experiment. And in the Little Albert experiment, basically, he took a 9-month old little Albert, and then he kind of like introduced him to a stimuli. And what was the stimuli? The stimuli was a white rabbit or a white rat. I don't know, rabbit, one of them. Okay, let me confirm. Okay, it was a white rat. So he put Albert, who was a 9 months old, together with a white rat. And then when the first time Albert came in contact with that stimuli, he didn't necessarily react to the stimuli. Like he was even going towards the rat, trying to play with the rat. But then over time, his assistant, that was also part of the experiment, every time Albert tried to move towards the rat, she hit a bell, and then Albert started to cry whenever that bell was hit or whenever that bell was strong, that kind of thing. So what the Little Albert experiment demonstrated was that fear is a conditioned response, that you can condition a human being, a full-grown human being, to feel fear and to have the emotion of fear. So what that experiment did was that it brought conditioning as a forefront of studying behavior, that when it comes to human behavior, that behavior is as a result of the environment, the experiences that somebody has, and then the conditioning that they have. That behavior is not even about the genetic factor of an individual or the internal state of an individual or the instinctual state of an individual. That it is always dependent on behavior. Sorry, it's always dependent on environment, and it's always dependent on conditioning and the experience that the person is involved in. So you have to know that when it comes to John B. Watson, he was a very big nurture guy. He said, okay, nurture over nature. And what does that mean? It means that he believed very, very strongly on the environment in playing a factor when it comes to the development of behavior, or when it comes to behavior as a whole. He says that when it comes to behavior, humans are going to be conditioned, or humans are basically built by their environment as opposed to their genetic factor, or as opposed to their internal state. And the environment that an individual is what forms their behavior and is what forms their person as a whole. All right, so there was certain criticism that came up when that came up into behaviorism, because people believe that it was too focused on environment. It was too focused on environment. Like, it made it feel like mental processes was not necessary. That the only thing that was necessary was environment, and that was not true, because it also had to recognize, or the critics also said that you should recognize the fact that the internal state and the genetic factors of individuals also influence their behaviors, that it is not just about the environment that they find themselves in. That while environment can be a strong motivator for certain behaviors, that it is not the only motivator for certain behaviors. That things like the genetic and the internal state of the individual should also be considered when it comes to behavior. All right, so I think we talked about John B. Watson, behaviorism, and the our little Albert experiment. Okay. All right, so basically, like we know about conditioning, that behavior is learned through association with stimuli, and that emotional response could be learned through classical conditioning. I think we're already done when it comes to behaviorism, and then I hope we do understand the concept of behaviorism and how it is very, very environment focused and all of that. So now we'll be moving on to the third person, which is Skinner's operant conditioning. I mean, we've talked about Skinner's operant conditioning sometime, and sometime in the past. We've talked about what operant conditioning is. And basically, the idea of Skinner's operant conditioning was basically talking about the fact that when it comes to behavior, it is as a result of reinforcement and punishment. So Skinner's operant conditioning was basically focused on reinforcement and punishment. That you can train an individual, or you can direct a behavior through reinforcement or punishment. That we learn from our environment, or we learn through reinforcement and punishment. And what does that mean? It means that learning is only achieved, at least according to BF Skinner, operant condition, that learning is only achieved through reinforcement and punishment. And what does reinforcement mean? Reinforcement is like how would you say, maybe like a positive okay, let's just think of it like this. Reinforcement can be like, okay, let's explain this way. Reinforcement is something that increases the likelihood of a behavior to reoccur. Reinforcement is something that increases the likelihood of a behavior to reoccur. And then punishment is something, or is a concept that reduces the likelihood for a behavior to reoccur. So what does that mean? It means that when you are reinforced, the likelihood that you're going to perform that particular behavior again is higher. But then when you're punished, the likelihood that you're going to perform that behavior again is lower. So with Skinner's operant conditioning, it was basically talking about there are basically two types of reinforcement and two types of punishment. So we have negative reinforcement and positive reinforcement, and then we have negative punishment and positive punishment. And what does that mean? Negative reinforcement means that you are removing something unpleasant to allow for a behavior, to allow for the likelihood of a behavior to reoccur. And then when it comes to positive reinforcement, it means that you're adding something pleasant, or you're adding something positive to allow for a behavior to reoccur. So what does that mean? Let me give an example of positive reinforcement. So for example, let's assume that you want your child to um stop talking loudly. So what you can do is that when you want to positively reinforce that particular behavior that you want, what you can do is that when this individual performs that behavior, and then you want that behavior to change, or you want to modify that behavior, because it's all about building up behavior or modifying behavior. And then you want to modify that behavior. Let's say anytime that they say, oh, or they are talking loudly on the phone, and you tell them, oh, kindly reduce your voice. And then you give them, let's say when they now agree to reduce their voice, and then they start to reduce their voice, you now give them like a bar of chocolate. So a bar of chocolate is like giving them something pleasant to commend their change in behavior, or so that when the next time where they are now talking, because of they've associated that positive experience with that particular behavior that you want, the likelihood of them now reducing their voice the next time they're on the phone call is now going to be higher. So that's basically what Skinner's operant condition is talking about. And then when it comes to punishment, positive punishment is about adding something unpleasant to make sure that a behavior does not reoccur, or to reduce the likelihood of a behavior reoccurring. And then when it comes to negative punishment, is that you are removing something pleasant. You're removing something pleasant to make sure that a behavior does not reoccur. So you have to understand that with reinforcement, it's about you wanting a behavior to occur again. You want this behavior to happen again. And then with punishment is that you want this behavior to not happen again. So with Skinner was basically saying that when it comes to learning, or when it comes to behavior, that we can guide humans' behavior through these processes of um, reinforcement and punishment. I do hope that we've understood all the concepts about the individuals that have contributed greatly to the field of cognitive psychology. And I do hope that we've understood this topic to an extent. I mean, if you want to read up on certain of these guys, because I mean we've talked about six of them, so you're very very free to just learn more about them and to understand their key ideas. I think we went from Dundas pioneering experiment, we talked about wound psychology laboratory, we talked about Embigos's memory experiment, we talked about William James's principle of psychology, we talked about John Watson's behaviorism approach, and then we finally talked about Skinner's operant conditioning. And I'm so glad for having you come along on this ride with me. So thank you very much. Have a lovely, lovely day, and good luck in your exams.